lockdown. Hello, my name's Andy Wright. I'm going to be talking about heating your homes without costing the earth as part of the COP26 series. So welcome everybody, and can we start the presentation? Thank you. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the context of all this, the heating and carbon emissions in the UK, gas boilers and gas prices, very topical, a bit about our housing stock in the UK, how we can go about reducing heating costs, very simple, easy things to do, and the big question whether to replace your boiler, and then a little bit about the future of heating, possible new systems we may be using in a few years' time. So to set the context, COP26 starts on Sunday in Glasgow, and there are two big issues here. The first is the fact we have seen, particularly this year actually, massive impacts of climate change on the world, terrible fires in North America, heat waves in Canada, very dramatic flooding in Germany and China, other places. So we really are seeing some very worrying and big effects of climate change. On the other hand, we have, in order to limit climate change, ideally to, or at least to 1.5 degrees increase of temperature, if we can, no more than that, but it's not looking very good at the moment. So the carbon reductions to reduce the further effects of climate change is a big thing for COP. And then on the other hand, we have our dependable gas boilers, we have an inefficient housing stock, and we have a massive increase in gas prices in the last few weeks, even since I agreed to do this talk. In fact, I didn't realize how appropriate the title was going to be. So the UN Framework on Climate Change, UNFCCC, has its meeting, the Conference of the Parties of the COP in Glasgow, and in some quarters it's seen as almost a last chance to agree cuts to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees by 2100. So climate change is driven mainly by greenhouse gases from men's activities, the activities of man, I should say, and mostly carbon dioxide from burning fuels, but also methane and other gases as well contribute to it. The UK has a target of 78% by 2035 and 100% reduction by 2050, which is really challenging. We just heard, I think yesterday, that the atmospheric concentration had gone up to 413 parts per million. That compares to 280, the long-term pre-industrialization level, the natural level. And despite a slight fall in emissions due to COVID last year, the actual amount in the atmosphere is still increasing. And a significant part, about 18%, is from buildings, and that compares with 23% transport, 10% electricity, 10% aviation. That's 2019 data, so not influenced by COVID. If we look at that graphically, we'll see that the red dashed line is electricity supply emissions, and that has reduced quite steadily and dramatically since 2000, mainly because we've closed coal stations and replaced them with lots of wind generation and a significant amount of solar now. Buildings, which is the purple dashed line, is much less, is reducing much less, mainly through improved gas boilers and some improvements in the housing stock and the building stock, but that's only reducing slowly and is now 18%. The blue line at the top is transport, which is staying pretty flat, but may reduce quite sharply as we go towards electric cars. If we look at that in terms of our targets, we've come down to a 45% reduction to 2019 from the benchmark of 1990. But to get further is going to be much more challenging. We've done the easy stuff like building wind turbines, and now we come into the really challenging stuff like heating. So those are the targets: 68% 2030, 78% 2035, and 100% by only 2050, which isn't really that far away. So coming on to gas boilers, I think there's about 85-90% of homes use a gas boiler, over 20 million of them in use, and most commercial buildings use gas boilers as well. They use methane, fossil fuel methane, which is easily transported through the pipe network. Actually, not completely fossil fuel, because now they're injecting, I think, about 5% of biogas, renewable biogas from sewage plants and so on into the network. So there's a little bit of renewables in your gas boiler, but not very much. Combustion is efficient in about 80 or 90% in a modern boiler. They provide rapid heating at high temperature, very quick response. Air pollution is minimal if you ignore the CO2, which is harmless as a sort of air pollutant, but obviously contributes to climate change. They basically produce CO2 and water. And gas used to be very cheap, but it's not looking so cheap anymore. In carbon terms, gas is much better than oil or coal, but still produces carbon dioxide, roughly 0.2 kilograms per kilowatt hour. And that is incidentally about the same as our modern electricity supply. It used to be much higher for electricity because of the generation of using coal, but now it's comparable to gas per unit. So to decarbonize, we need to replace most of our methane gas boilers with lower carbon alternatives, which is a big challenge. This is a graph of wholesale gas prices from the BBC website in the last 12 months. We see it started to rise in about May and has climbed very dramatically since August, from about 40 pence a therm to 258 pence a therm about a week ago, or 1.4 pence a kilowatt hour wholesale to nearly 9 pence. So that incredibly large increase in price, really dramatic. Gas prices, so they're about 6 or 7 times higher than a year ago. There are multiple reasons for that, including lack of storage. So we didn't have any sort of buffer of gas stored, geopolitics, COVID recovery, suddenly increasing demand. China is shifting away from coal, so he's pulling in a lot more of the gas supplies. There are lots of reasons for this. And interestingly, I went on a comparison site for this talk to try and get some data on future prices. But in fact, they won't actually even give you any prices at the moment, because they know that what your current tariff is bound to be cheaper than a new tariff. So there's no point really looking to switch. This is the message that comes up when you go on U-Switch. But after that, I got an email from my supplier Octopus with because I'm a 12-month tariff which runs out at the end of November. They were sending me the new tariffs, which are quite frightening. So the left chart shows the prices of gas and electricity unit prices. So the blue bar is my current tariff. The orange is the flexible tariff. Grey is a fixed 12-month where I'm guaranteed it not to go up, but then it's a lot higher anyway. And then yellow is the community power one, which includes money to basically subsidizing building new renewables, wind turbines. But if you look at the actual size of those bars, there's a huge increase from the current level, particularly for gas. On the right, there's just the overall annual cost for my home estimated. And then the table just shows that data in numbers. So if we look on the purple numbers on the right on the table, we've got a 36% increase for the cheapest flexible tariff, a doubling or over doubling to the 12-month tariff, 205%. And if I went for the community power option, which I don't think I will, it's a 3 times cost. So it's going from just over 1,000 a year to over 3,000 a year. So these are really, really big increases, much larger than I think I can ever remember happening to energy prices. It's probably worth mentioning that when you pay your bill, it's not by any means all for the actual fuel. The red block, the large red block, is the actual cost of the energy you're buying, or your supplier is buying for you, and that's about 41% of the bill, and the rest is from various other costs: network maintenance, social and environmental schemes, subsidy to subsidise insulation schemes and pay for PV feed-in tariffs and so on, VAT, operating costs, and then there's a small profit for suppliers, which of course, as the prices of what they were buying went up, has been wiped out completely by the price increase for people on some tariffs, and that's why some companies have gone out of business in the last month or so. In terms of heating, we have the challenge of an old building stock, because it was built sort of a long time ago. A lot of it because of the Industrial Revolution. Lots of solid wall homes. Solid walls are poorly insulated and expensive to retrofit any insulation onto. So that's up to about 1919. We have all solid wall, then we have mostly solid wall. From the 30s, we have some cavity walls which can be filled with insulation to make them better, but nowhere near modern standards. We get wall insulation coming from about the 1980s, but not getting to a really decent standard till the 1995 regulations, but still not particularly good. And then we got improvements since then. So the modern homes are a lot more insulated than they were in 95. And they're looking to revise that further. So the modern homes will be far better insulated than and more efficient than the older homes. The timber frame is also usually an efficient way to do it, and they came in about the 90s. So we have this challenge of a really difficult housing stock. You can, as I say, you can insulate, retrofit cavity walls, which will improve things, but not massively. So I'd like to move on now to some short-term free or low-cost solutions, which mainly apply to gas or oil central heating, but they may apply to some other, in some of them will apply to any system. These are things you can do very easily. So in looking at when it's needed, where it's needed, how much is needed, whether to use gas or electricity, and spaces and sun. So first of all, when it's needed, almost all systems have a time clock. If you haven't got a time clock, then you definitely need to get one. Most look something like this, or a more modern version of this. First of all, make sure the clock's on the right time. Might have drifted. And just to remind you, do need to adjust for the summertime, wintertime. So on Sunday night, I shall be adjusting my clock on here for the hour changing. Make sure the heating isn't on 24 hours a day, which is probably just the on setting. Make sure the on-off times fit your lifestyle, when you get up, when you go to bed, when you're around in the daytime or not, etc. Weekends are probably different from weekdays. Adjust the times seasonally as well, not just for the time clock, but in the autumn and spring, you'll need less heating so that it could come on later or go off sooner. You can make adjustments which will save you some energy. And if you've got a very old or difficult to set time clock, then consider upgrading. It's quite cheap, because it's just swapping out the box for another box. There's nothing else involved. So we come on to where needed and how much. First of all, only heat the rooms you use regularly. You might want to maintain some heat in a room that's empty, because if in an old house, particularly with solid walls, it may get quite damp and damage the fabric if you have no heating at all in the cold weather. Turn on heating rooms used just occasionally, just when you need it, not all the time. Adjust the heating level to the use of the room. So if bedrooms, often people have cooler than other rooms, just turn it down to a low setting 2 or something, or even off if you can. And adjust clothing. I'm wearing a warm fleece in this room to reduce the heating need. And these TRVs, thermostatic radiator valves, are a really good investment if you haven't got them in all rooms. Very, very efficient, very effective, and a great way of reducing heating use. There'll always be at least one radiator without one, because the system needs a sort of safety valve. If all of them shut down because it's warm, then one has to stay open to let the water flow around the system. But a very good investment. There are 2 other thermostats on a heating system. One is on the return temperature on the left. So this is my rather old boiler, which is manually set, and that controls the return water temperature to the boiler, usually between about 50 and 70 degrees. If this is set very high, which it may be, then it means that you have very hot radiators which are putting too much heat in, and it's a fairly inefficient way to run the system, particularly in warmer weather. So you can turn that down to the right settings so that you're not getting very hot water in the radiators, as long as that's enough heat. Also, if you have a condensing boiler, that needs to be as low as you can to make the condensing work, to be cool enough to condense the steam out of the gases that are burnt. And then on the right, or in the middle and the right, we have the room thermostat. The middle one is an older one. This is mine, which is in the hallway, and it just controls the entire system. And once that reaches a set point, it will turn the whole system off until it cools down again. And that's definitely worth having. Most systems will have it anyway, and it avoids overheating the house when you don't need to. And then on the right, we have the digital version of that, which combines the room thermostat in the middle with the time clock I showed earlier. So there's buttons you can press to set time on, time off, and so on. This is called a programmable thermostat. So that combines those functions, but make sure they're set to the right settings. Then we come on to whether to use gas or electricity. You might think gas is always better because it's cheaper, but in terms of carbon, electricity used to be much higher, about 2.5 times more than gas. But because of all the renewables, now on average it's about the same as gas. So you're not saving carbon by using gas instead of electricity. And in fact, if you're buying electricity through with a renewable tariff, it'll be a zero carbon energy anyway. So it's zero carbon. Electric heating is 100% efficient. All the energy that goes into that device turns into heat, and it's very quick response. So it's a very effective heating system. However, of course, the price of electricity is 4 or 5 times more than the gas, even with the increases, because electricity will go up as well. Although the relative costs might be slightly different, but they will both. It's always going to be more expensive, and that's why we use gas. So heating one room with electricity may well be cheaper and lower carbon than running the whole central heating system in the whole house. For example, one person working at home, electric heating one room is probably better than heating your whole house. Do make sure it has a thermostat, otherwise it's inefficient. And then finally, spaces and sun. Make use of the sun. It's free. It's a big source of heat. And the sun will warm rooms significantly, even in winter. In fact, solar gains can be higher in a room than summer in the spring and autumn, because of the lower angles means the more heat's getting into the room in around this time of year. You can get quite a lot of heat coming in from the sun. So consider using rooms with sunshine, south facing, for example, to work in and have a warmer room. So moving on to the question of whether to get a new boiler. This is a question I'm actually wrestling with at the moment, because mine is fairly old, but it's a really tricky one. if your boiler is more than 20 years old, it probably is not condensing and is probably around 75 or 80% efficient. Could be as low as 60 if you've got a very old boiler. A condensing boiler is about 90% efficient if the return temperature is 55 degrees or less, which means that the heat exchanger in the boiler is cool enough to condense out the water from when you burn the methane. So when you burn methane, you get carbon dioxide and water vapor. If you have hot return temperature, then that water vapor will stay as vapor and go out through your flue. If it's a bit cooler, then it will condense onto the heat exchanger, turn back to liquid water, and release its heat. And that's how you get the extra 10% efficiency, provided you've got the right temperature setting. A new boiler costs around £1,600, which is pretty cheap, really, and will save you gas and cost, assuming it's an inefficient one being replaced. But the government has a longer-term aim in its new heating strategy published about a week ago to phase out gas boilers altogether. They've sort of rode back a bit from their original that they would be illegal to saying our ambition is to phase out installation of natural gas boilers, a gradual transition, no one will be forced to remove existing boilers and so on. So I think they recognise the difficulty of just saying you can't have gas boilers, because there's a lot of challenges in the alternatives, as I'll come on to. So now moving on to longer term replacements to methane gas boilers. For any of these, it's really important to minimize heat loss first, i.e. through insulation and better air tightness and so on, which will reduce the capital cost of a probably fairly expensive system and the running cost as well. So look at the fabric of the building first before looking at other options. So hydrogen, we've heard a lot about hydrogen recently, and I suppose I'm a hydrogen skeptic in some ways. So hydrogen is clearly a zero carbon fuel. When you burn methane, you're basically burning carbon and hydrogen together, hence producing carbon dioxide. When you're burning hydrogen, you're just burning hydrogen, which produces water. It's easy to make hydrogen. You just split it with electricity, split the molecule of water into hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, which is about 80% efficient. If it's made with renewable electricity, that's called green hydrogen. If it's made with natural gas, methane, it's called blue hydrogen. It's the same gas, of course, it's just the way it's made. It can be burnt like methane, or it can be used in a fuel cell, which is a kind of reverse process which produces water, electricity, and heat. It can be compressed and stored, but it does take energy to compress it, significant energy. It can be put in vehicles, which use fuel cells to make electricity to drive a vehicle. And that will probably make sense for vehicles like trucks and trains, which are too big and heavy to carry massive batteries. And it could replace methane. It could replace methane in modified gas boilers. Remembering the town gas that I can just remember as a kid, we had town gas before natural gas came in, was actually about 50% hydrogen. So we've been here before, in a sense, although that was made from coal, so it was very, very high carbon. But if we just use it like that for heating, it will be an incredibly inefficient process and a very expensive use of renewable electricity. It might be relatively easy to do it. We just maybe modify or replace our boilers and kind of carry on burning hydrogen. But if you think about the energy involved, if you start with 100 units of electricity, you get 80 units of hydrogen out because of the efficiency of that transformation. You burn it and you may need to compress it and then transport it, may lose another 10%. And then you burn it in the boiler and lose another 10%. So you might be looking at 60% of what your original electricity turning into heat. Well, you might as well just use electricity, electric heater. There's no point going through that expensive and wasteful process to get to heat. certainly has a role in other things like possibly aircraft and transport, but not I think as just as a replacement for methane. So moving on, heat pumps. We're all familiar with the heat engines, which move heat from cold to hot, essentially to produce mechanical energy, such as a steam engine, petrol engine, gas turbine. A heat pump is simply reversing that. It's using mechanical energy to move heat from cold to hot against the natural flow of heat from from hot to cold. And the mechanical energy to make that happen is provided from an electric compressor. It doesn't have to be electric, but it always is because it's just the easiest way to do it. Air conditioners, refrigerators are heat pumps, but they're extracting heat from inside to outside. For buildings, a heat pump normally refers to moving heat from outside to inside in winter. Some are reversible. They're quite common in some countries where they have cold winters, warm summers. They just have cooling in the summer, heating in the winter, but often in the UK, they'll just produce heat in one direction. It's very important to understand that you're only moving heat. You're not just using electricity to make heat. So the COP of performance, coefficient of performance, or COP, which is the ratio of heat out to energy in, is greater than 1, usually around 3, 4, 5, possibly more. Hence, they are energetically, in a sense, are more than 100% efficient because they're just moving heat. They're not just like a boiler, just taking energy and turning it into heat. So there's two main contenders for heat pumps for the UK. First is air source. This shows an outside unit, which is the bit that collects the heat from the air. So there'll be a cold coil in there, which is absorbing heat when the fan blowing out the air over it to absorb the heat and then taking it inside the house. And then boosting its temperature to a higher level. So these are the cheapest and most common systems. We have the outdoor unit extracting heat, and the heat pump will turn hot water into hot water or hot air with a COP of about 2.5 to 3. So 2.5 or 3 times the electricity input is heat. Cheapest systems are not cheap. They're £4,000 to £8,000, something like that. So double or more the cost of a new boiler. And the important point is they may not work with existing radiators because they're usually designed to work at fairly low water temperatures to make them reasonably efficient, not at the high temperatures of a gas boiler. So it might be that your radiators would not be big enough to at this lower temperature to provide enough heat. The prices will probably fall as the market grows. We're at a fairly early stage of the market at the moment, but they are inherently quite complex systems. They're quite common on the continent, in Scandinavia, North America, and so on, but not in the UK yet. And because we're using low carbon electricity and then we're multiplying it by the COP, it means the carbon content of the heat is much lower than a gas system. The other one is the ground source heat pump, where we're using heat from the ground. Exactly the same principle, essentially a very similar device, the actual pump part itself, but the heat is coming from pipes buried in the ground. You pump brine, salt water around the system, collect the heat from it from underground. That may be a horizontal pipe or more normally a vertical pipe, which can be as deep as 100 meters underground. It's a lot more expensive to install than an air source because of the drilling costs and all the pipes and things. It doesn't work on all soil types. Some types of, well, below the soil you have obviously rock. Some rock types are not very good because they insulate this effectively too much, and the heat can't flow into the pipes fast enough to work effectively. The ground is warmer than the air in winter, something around 10 degrees versus something averaging around 5 degrees for the air. So they're more efficient because the smaller the temperature difference, the more efficient the system is. Easier to get heat from 10 degrees and boost it up to 50 than take it at 5 degrees and boost it to 50. So the COP is higher as a result, typically 3 or 4 instead of maybe 2.5, 3. Typical costs are a bit frightening. £15,000 up to 30,000. It varies an awful lot depending on the size of the property, the ground conditions, the site access for the drilling, lots of factors, but it's a lot of money. Technically, it works very well, and as with air source, you could use it for cooling as well. You just reverse the process, put the heat into the ground in the summer, which obviously makes it slightly better in the winter because you've got warmer ground to start with. But overall, a good solution, but in a technical sense, but really expensive. There are some other options. Simple direct electric, which is really cheap and simple, but very expensive per unit. District heating, which obviously only works when you're on a district network, but that is quite common on new developments, and city centres often have district heating, including Leicester. Solid fuel stoves got a very bad press a few years ago because of air pollution. If it's a renewable and clean burning fuel, then an efficient stove, it is an option, but they're only likely really to heat one room, so not a sensible solution for a whole house. And then there's looking on the demand side, just making your home very efficient. Really, this is mostly about new build, passive house standard, and really high levels of insulation and air tightness and so on will almost eliminate the need for heating and bring it right down, in which case direct electric may be fine because you're using so little of it. And the future will probably be more complicated. On the left is a picture of my gas boiler, 3 pipes going to it, gas pipe and 2 water pipes. On the right is a colleague's new build home, which has an air source heat pump. In addition to this, there's the unit outside I showed earlier. To be fair, my system also has a water tank inside the house. But this on the right, you see there are a lot more pipes. The wiring will all get tidied up inside the box, hopefully. But they have a lot more valves and pumps, and the network itself is more complicated. The controls are more complicated. So we are moving towards a better controlled and more intelligent but more complicated future for heating. So to summarize, we have I think everyone recognizes a real climate emergency and a need to reduce carbon emissions. Most heating at the moment is from fossil methane gas boilers. We've seen a very sharp rise in gas prices, for now at least, probably in the future as well. The government wants to phase out our boilers. Likely options are heat pumps, probably some district heating, possibly hydrogen, but I'm pretty skeptical on that. And whatever system we move to, the chances are it'll be a much higher capital cost and a more complex system. Running costs of these systems are somewhat uncertain, but probably cheaper or comparable to gas going forward, depending on lots of factors, but they're unlikely to be a lot more expensive. And carbon emissions will definitely be lower from the non-gas systems mainly because we've decarbonised our electricity to a fair extent. That's it. Do we have any questions? There's a comment saying, "Are heat pumps the future?" Well, I think as I outline later in the talk, to some extent, yes. I think they're the biggest contender for heating But there are some other options, but they're likely to be the main way we heat. Yes. Can a smart meter help to reduce your energy usage? That's a really interesting question. We actually did the analysis of, I think it was about 29,000 homes data. About half had smart meters for a large utility, one of the big six, some years ago. And the idea from the government was, by having smart meters, we'd all save, I think 10% was the number floated around. In fact, the savings were almost statistically undetectable, because a smart meter itself is just a meter. It doesn't save you any energy at all. The idea was, by having feedback to households, people might use less energy. I think the short answer is no, or a very small amount possibly. If you notice you're wasting energy, perhaps you might notice on your monitor. I had one of these monitors, and after I looked at it a few times, I got used to what it was going to say, and I just ignored it. Where the big advantage of smart metering is, apart from the convenience of not having to provide meter readings or let people in to come and read your meter, is that the utilities can manage the system better, and the network can be managed more intelligently, so that you can have much more sophisticated tariffs and shift load around and so on. So that there's a benefit to the network, certainly. Whether you save energy as directly just from having a smart meter, I think the answer is no. Yeah, so is a wood burner better or worse than the gas central heating? Good question. If it's from a renewable source, sustainable wood, yes, in that it should be, in theory, zero carbon emissions overall, because of the wood is regrown. In terms of local air pollution, possibly, well, almost certainly not. You almost certainly produce more pollution than a gas boiler. If it's a very well-designed burner and it's efficient and you've got the right fuel, then the air pollution should be pretty small. I think there are some new regulations about this as well. You have to obey, but if you're just burning some of these logs in an old wood burner, then probably no, because you'd be producing a lot of pollution locally, although you could not be producing the carbon dioxide. Okay. Are you better having your heat on at a low constant temperature all day, or switching it on and off? That's everyone asks. This is such a common question. The answer is turn it on and off when you need it, basically, when and where you need it. The argument for that is that if you have it on, basically the amount of heat you need or gas you burn is proportional to the difference in temperature inside to outside. So if you have it on low all the time, you'll end up with a higher internal temperature. Hence, the difference in temperature will be higher over 24 hours. Hence, over that 24 hours, you'll burn more gas to keep that constant temperature. It might be sensible for a very slow response system like a coal boiler or something, where turning it on and off is impractical. But for a modern boiler which can turn on instantly and heat up within 10 minutes, no is the answer. Is it realistic for councils to retrofit inefficient housing wide scale? Is the industry knowledgeable enough? This is a really big question. Whether it's councils or individuals or whatever, there's a massive challenge to do this. If it's simple things like pumping stuff into walls, cavity walls, or putting loft insulation, that's pretty reliable and easy to do. To do retrofit, for example, solid wall with external insulation, it's really expensive and quite disruptive and needs to be done properly. There's lots of organizational issues around it, of dealing with the occupants and making the whole supply chain work. So the supply chain for the construction in the UK, even for large buildings, is very fragmented. Lots of small companies, lots of sort of an inefficient way of working in a sort of confrontational way very often, driven by cost, not by carbon. So I think that's a massive challenge. Is it realistic? Well, they need a lot of money to do that if they're paying for it, and they don't have a lot of money at the moment after COVID and so on. So in the future, I think we'll have to do that. If we need to get to low carbon, it makes a lot of sense to do it, not just to save energy, but also to make homes much more comfortable, have less mold, have improve health. There's a big payback in terms of health cost saving on treating people in hospital and so on. So it's well worth doing, but it needs the supply chain to improve and a load of money. Will we have enough renewables? That's another big question. And of course, we have electric cars coming down the track, to mix metaphors, which would also take a lot of electricity. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. We're certainly expanding renewables a lot. One of the big issues around electricity is the time it's produced. There are times, say it's a windy night, 1 o'clock in the morning, blowing a gale in the North Sea. We've got loads of electricity from all our wind turbines, but nowhere to put it. So we need to look at smart controls, probably electric storage. We're beginning to see some batteries coming into the grid now at sort of large scale, or to support the grid and sort of even out the loads. If there was a breakthrough in battery technology, then we could potentially store on a much larger scale, and then we could just generate loads of renewables and store it. But we're not there yet. So there's a big issue about balancing supply and demand, which you can basically have to do more or less instantaneously with the electricity, unlike gas. So yeah, we will need to expand our supply. But if with smart controls, you can shift load around. You could turn a heat pump on earlier, say, or turn appliances off for a short time, like refrigerators and so on, to avoid peaks. And so lots of smart things we can do to even out the 24-hour demand on the grid. But yeah, it is a challenge. Yeah. No, is the answer to that, because if you look at the difference between solar in the summer and winter, we have, I think it's roughly 4 times more solar in summer than winter. There are days, weeks sometimes of no sun, foggy, cloudy weather in January, when you have just no direct electric. If it's sunny enough to run your heating, then the chances are you don't need heating, or not very much, because you've got sun coming into the house. So the answer is no. Over a year, if you've got lots of panels, then your total generation may be, well, it wouldn't be enough for direct electric. It might just about run a heat pump if you had loads of panels. My 4 kilowatt rooftop system produces about 4,000 kilowatt hours a year, but that's nowhere near the amount of heating I need, even in a fairly modern house. What would you choose? Interesting question. I think that the simplest answer to that would be an air source heat pump. If you had lots of spare cash, you might go for a ground source, which in the longer run will be cheaper to run, but would cost you a lot more. So an air source is probably a sensible option, but you need to really do a sort of cash flow analysis over 20 years to work out, how they balance out, because you will use more electricity each year with an air source system. I think we're almost out of time. We seem to be out of questions as well. So thanks everybody for taking part, joining in, and watching the presentation. I hope it was interesting and possibly useful, and I hope you might be able to save a little bit of energy and cost. And hope the questions were. I did my best to answer the questions as well.